Women in song. Wine. I'm not too crazy about wine.
Those words came from a man the world believed it already understood. To the public, Dean Martin was easy to define. A glass of scotch in one hand, a cigarette between his fingers, and a grin that made everything around him feel lighter than it really was. He seemed like a man who never had to try, never had to explain himself, and never let anything cut too deeply. But behind that effortless laughter, behind the sold-out rooms, the bright television lights, and the applause that followed him from city to city, Dean Martin carried something the spotlight never fully reached. A name, a face, a feeling he had never quite managed to put away. They called him the King of Cool. And in many ways, he made coolness look like a kind of religion. He moved slowly, smiled easily, sang smoothly, and let the world believe that nothing ever truly touched him.
I love to sing and I love women.
For decades, audiences accepted that version of Dean Martin, charming, untroubled, untouchable. But sometimes the men who appear the least affected are the ones carrying the most. And Dean Martin, for all his practiced ease, was no exception. This is not the story the world already knows. This is the one he kept quiet. Very few entertainers in history have managed to make an entire era feel as though it belonged to them. Dean Martin was one of those rare figures. From the late 1950s onward, he moved through Hollywood, Las Vegas, and American living rooms with a kind of unhurried grace no one could quite copy.
Oh, I drink, but I'm not a boozer, not an alcoholic or anything like that.
He did not seem to chase fame. Fame seemed to follow him. His voice, warm, relaxed, and unmistakable, became one of the most recognizable sounds of the 20th century. He sang as if the words cost him nothing, as if every note simply rolled out of him without effort. But some of those recordings carried more weight than they seemed to at first. In 1956, when he stepped into the studio and recorded "Memories Are Made of This," the song became a massive hit. It rose to #1 and stayed there for 6 weeks. On the surface, it was bright, simple, and cheerful, the kind of song a man might sing when life had arranged itself exactly the way it was supposed to. But beneath that easy melody was something more complicated. The song sounded like a list of everything a good life was meant to contain: love, family, home, tenderness, and the quiet comfort of belonging somewhere. It was a gentle little inventory of the very things Dean Martin spent much of his life trying to hold together. Because away from the records, away from the stage, and away from the cameras that followed him everywhere, his personal life was far less graceful than his public image suggested. He had been married. He had loved deeply. He had made choices that came with consequences. More than once, he found himself caught between the life he wanted and the life his career demanded. And long before the world began wondering which woman had truly meant the most to him, there was a life he had already left behind.
But I'm not lazy. They want to think I'm lazy, but they know I work.
Before we go any further, tell me which Dean Martin song has stayed with you the longest. Drop it in the comments below. I want to know. Before the Rat Pack, before the television specials, before the name Dean Martin meant anything at all, there was a young man from Steubenville, Ohio, named Dino Crocetti. He was the son of Italian immigrants, raised in a working-class neighborhood where ambition was not something people talked about often. Survival came first. Dreams came later, if they came at all. Dino boxed for a while. He dealt cards. He worked jobs that left his hands tired and his nights open for something else, something quieter, something that kept pulling him toward music, toward a microphone, toward small stages where the applause was uncertain but the possibility was real. It was during those early years, before the journey had fully begun, that he met Elizabeth Ann MacDonald. Everyone called her Betty. Betty was not drawn to celebrity. She was not chasing fame, glamour, or the shine of show business. She was grounded, steady, and unimpressed by the entertainment world that was slowly beginning to circle the young man she loved. What she saw in Dino Crocetti was not a future legend, not a star, not the man millions would one day call the king of cool. She saw the man himself, not the polished public figure the world would eventually fall in love with, but the uncertain, ambitious young man beneath it all. Dino could be warm, funny, and deeply affectionate, though he did not always know how to show those parts of himself openly. Around Betty, he did not have to perform. He did not have to become anyone else. In 1941, they married.
I mean, could I be where I am today if I were lazy and if I were a boozer?
For a while, the life they built together was modest, honest, and real. There was nothing glamorous about it. No flashing cameras, no packed showrooms, no crowds waiting outside theater doors. Just two young people trying to build a future while the world around them moved at its own difficult pace. Betty understood the real Dino in a way that would later become almost impossible for anyone else to replicate. She had known him before the performance began, before the accent softened, before the name changed, before the grin became part of the act the public expected every time he walked into a room. She had known the man underneath all of it. Friends who knew them during those early years often remembered something simple but important about the way Dino behaved around her. He seemed lighter somehow, less guarded, less rehearsed, as if the exhausting effort of becoming Dean Martin had not yet turned into a permanent habit. Around Betty, he could still disappear back into himself. There were 4 children. There were years of financial uncertainty while his career struggled to take shape. Some nights brought opportunity, others brought disappointment. But through all of it, Betty remained steady. While Dino chased the possibility of something bigger, she held together the ordinary life waiting for him at home. But the entertainment world does not move at the same pace as a family kitchen in Ohio. As Dino Crocetti slowly transformed into Dean Martin, the distance between who he had been and who he was becoming grew harder to cross. Success changes people long before they realize it has happened. The nights became longer. The travel became constant.
And when I work, it's serious work. And the serious work that I do, I try to have a little fun with it.
And once his partnership with Jerry Lewis exploded into national fame, his life no longer belonged entirely to him. Together, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis became one of the most successful comedy duos America had ever seen. They seemed to create electricity simply by standing beside each other. Audiences could not look away. Their chemistry felt wild, unpredictable, and alive in a way television had rarely captured before. And while the country laughed, screamed, and applauded, something quieter was happening behind the scenes. The marriage that had existed before the fame was beginning to fracture beneath it.
Martin's comedy act with Jerry Lewis made him a household name. But it was Martin's post-Lewis career that made him a star.
By 1949, it was over. Sometimes the love that comes before everything else becomes the one that never completely leaves, even after it is gone. And for Dean Martin, there were people who believed Betty remained a quiet presence in his emotional life long after the marriage itself had ended. But life moved forward, at least publicly. The same year his first marriage came to an end, Dean married Jean Bieger. Jean was elegant, composed, and remarkably capable. She understood the demands of living beside a man the public treated almost like shared property. By then, Dean Martin was no longer just a performer. He was becoming an institution. Fans wanted him everywhere at once, smiling, singing, entertaining, and always appearing untouched by pressure. Jean helped make that possible. She ran the household with a calm efficiency that allowed Dean to remain exactly who the world expected him to be: available, charming, cheerful, and unruffled. While his career accelerated through Hollywood films, Las Vegas residencies, television appearances, and the legendary Rat Pack years, Jean became the steady center holding the private world together behind the scenes. 3 more children were born during their marriage. To outsiders, they looked like the picture of stability. the glamorous entertainer and the elegant wife beside him.
I wouldn't change one thing. Not one thing.
And those who spent time around them often remarked on the sense of order Jean brought into a life that could easily have collapsed into chaos. In many ways, she became the architecture of Dean Martin's stability. But even during those successful years, there always seemed to be something sitting just beneath the surface. Dean Martin's public image depended on emotional distance. That was part of the magic. He was the man at the party who somehow never appeared fully present at it. The man laughing in the center of the room while keeping some hidden part of himself somewhere far away. Friends from the Rat Pack years sometimes struggled to describe the quality Dean Martin carried beneath the surface. It was not exactly sadness, not bitterness either. It was something quieter and more difficult to explain, like a private room inside him that remained permanently closed, no matter how loud the celebration became around him. And during those years, the celebrations never seemed to stop. Las Vegas adored him. Hollywood depended on him. Audiences filled theaters just to hear him speak a few lazy lines into a microphone before drifting into song. Everywhere he went, people saw the same man, relaxed, amused, impossible to rattle. But there were moments when the performances themselves hinted at something deeper. In 1964, Dean Martin recorded "Everybody Loves Somebody." The song became one of the defining hits of his career and famously knocked the Beatles out of the #1 position on the Billboard charts. To the public, it sounded like triumph, a timeless romantic anthem delivered by a man who seemed completely certain of himself. But if you listen carefully, the song carries another feeling underneath the confidence. It sounds less like certainty and more like persuasion. Almost as if Dean Martin was trying to convince himself that somewhere, somehow, everyone truly does belong to somebody. The performance feels warm on the surface, but beneath it is the voice of a man reaching for reassurance he could never fully hold on to. That contradiction followed him throughout much of his life. By 1973, after 24 years together, his marriage to Jeanne Beger came to an end. From the outside, it looked like the closing chapter of a long and successful Hollywood marriage. But long relationships are not always the deepest ones. Sometimes time itself becomes the only evidence that love once existed there at all. And once the noise surrounding Dean Martin's life began to quiet down, the parts of his story people rarely talk about finally came into view. There is a version of Dean Martin's life that effectively ends sometime around the mid-1960s. The image had already been perfected by then. The tuxedo, the drink, the effortless charm, the Rat Pack mythology. In the eyes of the public, the legend was complete. But the man himself kept living long after the applause softened. Those later years, quieter, lonelier, and far less examined, reveal more about him than the famous years ever did. After his second marriage ended, Dean entered a brief third marriage in 1973 to Catherine Hahn, a woman nearly 30 years younger than he was. The relationship lasted less than 3 years. Even people close to him rarely described it as a true love story. It felt more like something else. The attempt of a man approaching old age to outrun a loneliness he could no longer disguise with charm, alcohol, work, or applause. Friends from that period remembered him differently than before. The public version of Dean Martin could still appear when necessary. He could still deliver the smile, still sing the songs, still make an audience feel as though nothing in the world could touch him. But offstage, the effort had become visible. The pauses lasted longer. The silences deepened. The distance people had once mistaken for coolness now felt more like exhaustion. Then, on March 21, 1987, everything changed. His son, Dean Paul Martin, Jr., known to most people as Dino Jr., died when his Marine Corps jet crashed into Mount San Gorgonio during a training exercise. He was only 35 years old. Dean Martin was 69. People who knew him said the loss shattered something fundamental inside him. The grin never disappeared completely, but something behind it went permanently quiet. He canceled a tour he had already begun rehearsing for. Public appearances became rare. The man who had once moved effortlessly through casinos, television studios, and crowded restaurants slowly retreated from the world that had adored him for decades. Some evenings, he could be found sitting at a window table in a small Italian restaurant on La Cienega Boulevard, often alone. Sometimes nearly so. He ordered the same meals, sat in the same place, and spent long stretches simply watching the street outside. There was something heartbreaking about the image. Dean Martin had spent most of his life making effortlessness look natural. But now, in those final years, he seemed to be doing something much harder, simply continuing. And it was during this quieter period, when the applause had faded and there was no longer anything left to perform for, that people closest to him began noticing something unexpected. A name that surfaced more than the others, a face from much earlier in his life. A woman who had known him before fame had reshaped him into somebody larger than himself. Because the person who may have truly held Dean Martin's heart was not necessarily the woman who stood beside him during the glamorous years, the casino years, or the years the cameras followed him everywhere. It may have been the woman who existed before any of it began, Betty MacDonald. The woman who knew Dino Crocetti before the world called him Dean Martin, before the accent softened, before the tuxedos, before the television lights and the carefully perfected smile, before loneliness became something he learned to hide behind performance. By the final years of his life, the world Dean Martin had once ruled had grown painfully quiet. The Rat Pack was gone. Many of the old friendships had faded into memory. The stages that once seemed unable to exist without him no longer needed him in the same way. Fame, which had once followed him effortlessly, slowly drifted elsewhere toward younger faces and newer voices. Frank Sinatra had grown older. Sammy Davis Jr. was gone. The Las Vegas that once belonged to their generation now existed mostly in faded recordings, old photographs, and stories told by people who had been there when the lights still felt immortal. And Dean Martin, perhaps the last of them to fully retreat from that world, had finally reached a place no amount of scotch, cigarette smoke, nightclub laughter, or television applause could postpone forever. He had slowed down enough to feel what remained. The people who spent time with him after the death of his son often described a man who had become, in certain ways, more honest than he had ever publicly been allowed to be. Not because he suddenly began confessing things openly, but because the performance itself was no longer necessary. For most of his life, Dean Martin had hidden behind ease, the relaxed smile, the carefully timed joke, the appearance of a man untouched by pressure, heartbreak, disappointment, or regret. That image had protected him for decades. The world loved him because he made life seem lighter than it really was. But in the quiet years, after the stages became less frequent and the crowds faded into distance, something simpler remained. And among the things that remained was a tenderness he still carried for the woman he had left behind in 1949. Betty MacDonald, the woman who had known Dino Crocetti before Dean Martin existed at all. Friends close to him in those final years have spoken about this carefully over time, never sensationally, never as gossip, but with a kind of quiet consistency. They noticed that he spoke of Betty differently than he spoke of anyone else, not with the polished nostalgia of a famous man casually revisiting old romances. Something about it felt unfinished. There was a softness there, a recognition that seemed deeper than memory itself. And what made Betty different from the other women in his life was not something dramatic or cinematic. It was something far simpler and, perhaps because of that, far more important. With Betty, there had never been performance. She had not fallen in love with Dean Martin, the celebrity, the entertainer, the man on magazine covers and casino marquees. She had loved Dino Crocetti, the uncertain young man from Steubenville who was still trying to figure out who he was and whether the world would ever notice him at all. She knew him before the fame hardened into identity, and that kind of love becomes almost impossible to replace. Because once the world turns you into a symbol, very few people are ever allowed close enough to know the person underneath it again. The public begins loving the performance, and over time even the performer can lose sight of where the act ends and the real self begins. But Betty had known him before any separation existed between those two things. She had known the version of him that disappeared later. People close to Dean in his final years often noticed that whenever he spoke about his early life, the Ohio years, the years before the name change, before the tuxedos and television cameras, something changed in his voice. It was subtle but unmistakable. The emotional distance he carried almost everywhere else seemed to soften for a moment. Not grief exactly, not even regret in the ordinary sense. Something closer to recognition. As if old age had finally given him enough distance to understand what parts of his life had actually been real. And if you listen carefully to the music he chose to record during certain periods of his life, you can hear traces of that understanding there too. His most intimate performances were rarely the triumphant songs. They were not the loud declarations or the swaggering anthems that audiences associated with the Rat Pack image. The songs that seemed to matter most to him in later years were quieter than that. Songs about memory, songs about time, songs about love that survives mostly in reflection, songs about looking back towards something you can still name clearly, even though you can no longer return to it. Dean Martin never spoke publicly about these feelings in the dramatic way modern audiences often expect from celebrities. He was not built for confession. He belonged to a generation of men who revealed themselves indirectly through pauses, through habits, through songs, and through the things they avoided saying aloud. But people who knew him heard it anyway. They heard it in the silences between sentences, in the stories that kept circling back to Ohio, in the name that continued resurfacing long after the marriage itself had ended. And perhaps most of all, in the quiet understanding that the woman who may have known him best was the woman who knew him before the world taught him how to hide himself. Because the truest love is not always the one that lasts the longest. Sometimes it is the one that belongs to the most honest version of who we once were. And for Dean Martin, that version may always have been Dino Crocetti, standing long before the fame, before the applause, before the loneliness, beside the woman who understood him when understanding him required no effort at all. Sometimes the love that stays with us the longest is not the one that lasts forever. Sometimes it is the one that knew us first, before the world reshaped us, before success complicated us, before disappointment hardened us into someone harder to recognize. And sometimes that person remains connected to the version of us we quietly lose along the way. In the end, Dean Martin's story is not really a story about fame. It is a story about what fame costs. For more than 4 decades, he gave the world the illusion of effortlessness. He walked into rooms and somehow made them feel warmer. He sang songs that sounded easy enough to float through the air without weight. He laughed at the perfect moment, smiled at the perfect time, and built one of the most recognizable public identities of the 20th century. To millions of people, Dean Martin represented comfort, style, ease, the fantasy that a person could move through life untouched by its heavier emotions. But behind every recording, every stage performance, every grinning television appearance, there existed another life entirely. A private life that was far more complicated, far more searching, and far more human than the legend ever allowed people to see. Behind the cool was a man who had loved early and sincerely. And perhaps more importantly, a man who never completely stopped carrying the weight of that early love, even after the world had long since stopped asking about it. When you look back at his career through that lens, some of his greatest songs begin to feel different. Everybody loves somebody. You're nobody till somebody loves you. Even the quiet middle moments hidden inside some of his most understated ballads. Listen carefully, and the performances no longer sound like simple confidence. They sound like someone reaching toward an idea he desperately wanted to believe in. A man searching for warmth, permanence, and connection while standing inside a life that constantly pulled him further away from all three. And maybe that is why those recordings still endure, because beneath the smoothness of the voice, beneath the relaxed delivery and perfect phrasing, there was something undeniably real. The sound of a man who spent much of his life trying to rediscover what he had once left behind. So now I want to ask you something. Which Dean Martin song do you hear differently after hearing this story? Tell me in the comments below. I'd genuinely love to know which performance feels different to you now and why. And before you go, think about this for a moment. Do you believe the love we experience before we become who the world wants us to be is often the love we carry the longest? That the people who knew us before the performance, before the success, before life changed us completely, hold a place no one else can ever fully reach? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if you enjoyed this story and want more untold Hollywood stories like this one, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.